Okay, everybody, we'd like to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Cochlear Center seminar. My name is Mindy Dimachowski, the staff host for today's meeting and an academic program coordinator for the Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health. Today's speaker is Dr. Willa Brenowitz, and she will be presenting on hearing loss and dementia. And today's faculty moderator will be Dr. Jennifer Deal, who will lead our session and monitor activity for any questions in the chat. Before we begin, I would like to share some ground rules for today's meeting. Participants should be muted upon entry. Please stay muted throughout this seminar. If you have a question you would like answered by today's speaker, please hold until the end of the presentation during the Q&A portion of the seminar, where you will be able to use either the raise your hand feature or the chat function. If you choose the raise your hand feature, our faculty moderator, Jennifer Deal, will call on you and you can ask your question verbally. If you would prefer for Dr. Deal to ask the question on your behalf, please use the chat function. This seminar is being recorded and will be posted to the Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health website. If you experience any technical difficulties, please reach out to Jamie Trumbo. Her contact information is on the screen. Thank you for joining us today. At this time, I would like to introduce our core faculty member, Dr. Jennifer Deal, to introduce our seminar speaker.
Thank you so much. As Mindy mentioned, my name is Jennifer Deal. I'm faculty with Cochlear Center in the Department of Epidemiology at Johns Hopkins and the Associate Director for Academic Training with the Cochlear Center. So I would like to take this moment and welcome you to our very first seminar of the year. Thank you for being with us. The Cochlear Center for Hearing and Public Health really is a one-in-kind center. We focus on thinking about understanding and addressing the impact of hearing loss in older adults. And our work as a center really spans the gamut from basic population-based research all the way up through thinking about how we can influence policy and have interventions, effective interventions in different settings. And so our mission really is to think about how we can address those issues as well as to train the next generation. And so we're delighted as a part of that mission to have this seminar series. We have a really exciting seminar series this year. We're showing right now what's coming up. So we have a couple of really great audiologists who will be joining us, including Dr. Larry Humes at our next meeting. We also have our Cochlear Center Research Day, which will be coming up on March 29th. And so that we hope that you'll be able to join us for that as well. Dr. Brett Rutherford will be here as our keynote speaker for that event. And he really his lab focuses on thinking about hearing and its relationship to depressive symptoms and dementia. So we're delighted to have him be our keynote this year. And so again, I think a really exciting speaker series. This speaker series is available on our website. And so we hope that you'll be able to join us for additional seminars. But right now I want to go ahead and get started with our first seminar of the year and introduce Dr. Willa Brenowitz. So Dr. Brenowitz is an assistant professor with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She earned that's at the University of California in San Francisco. She earned both her MPH and her PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle. After that, after her PhD, she was a senior fellow with the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center with the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Washington. And she also completed a postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Christine Yaffe in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California in San Francisco. Her research focuses on thinking about risk factors for dementia and has been very interested recently in thinking about sensory impairment, both from a multiple sensory deficits and its relationship with dementia, but also thinking about the mechanism that underlies this relationship, and thinking about kind of the use of novel causal inference methods and epidemiology and biostatistics to answer some of these questions. She's primarily funded by a National Institute on Aging K01 Career Development Award. That's looking at sensory impairments, cognitive decline, and dementia, and again, this mechanism, so what explains that association. So Dr. Brenowitz, we're delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us as our first seminar speaker of the year. And at this point, I invite everyone to help me welcome Dr. Brenowitz. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm gonna share my screen and get this started. All right, well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about some of this work and kind of taking this as a little bit of talking broadly about causal inference and testing alternative hypotheses, and then also focusing on some of my attempts to do this. And a lot of this is kind of an evolution of kind of my thinking and research focus. Kind of started with my postdoc at UCSF and now shifting into faculty position. And so some of the stuff I've been thinking about for a while, and kind of I think it complements a lot of the work that you guys are doing and kind of takes a different approach as well. So just going to give a little bit of a background on hearing loss and dementia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this stuff. And then do a brief introduction to frameworks for causal inference from an epidemiologic perspective. Talk about how we can like different alternative explanation for association between hearing and dementia, and then how to evaluate these different alternative pathways. So we all know, hopefully by now, that dementia is a public health priority. I just wanted to have a couple slides about kind of general ideas with dementia. So dementia is severe cognitive impairment that interferes with daily life. And really in the last 10 years or so, we've kind of come to this, the field has come to this focus of dementia as kind of a continuum of cognitive decline. People start off with having distinct brain pathologies that lead to dementia, but there's a long period where there might not be any symptoms, and then subtle symptoms that eventually lead to dementia. There's no effective treatment for dementia still, and prevalence may triple by 2050. So really we're interested in finding modifiable risk factors for dementia as a way to address this issue. Hearing loss is a potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia, and really has gained a lot of excitement recently because of this. It's consistently associated with dementia. This includes peripheral hearing measures, which are thought not to be as affected by neurodegeneration due to Alzheimer's disease and other factors, unlike measures like central hearing. And there are several hypothesized biologic mechanisms, such as increased cognitive demands, effects on social isolation, by which hearing loss may actually cause dementia. And then hearing loss can be corrected or mitigated, which is very appealing. I'm sure some of you have seen this before, the Lancet Dementia Commission, and now there's a new one, but kind of like this, the original figure, basically they really highlighted hearing loss as a potential modifiable risk factor for dementia, because through their estimates, they found that if they eliminated hearing loss based on the current estimates of the association, there would be a 9% reduction in dementia prevalence or incidence. And this was changed to 8% in the more recent one. And this is stronger than if we eliminated the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, which is the ApoE4 allele. And that was a 7% reduction. So this is all really exciting and intriguing, and I think especially for hearing researchers, this really gives a lot of credence to kind of focusing more on hearing loss and associations with dementia. But kind of, at least from an epidemiologic perspective, one of the big caveats is, okay, we have these estimates for reduction, but what is this really based on? So the estimates for dementia burden reduction assume that hearing loss causes dementia, and they assume that the entirety of the observational estimate is that hearing loss causes dementia. It kind of doesn't account for other potential biases. And because prior studies have mainly been observational, they may have been impacted by a variety of biases. And we don't really know kind of what the contribution of those potential biases and other pathways may be. And I think as kind of as a next step for what type of research we can be doing, one is going into clinical trials, which you guys are doing. But there's also still a lot of potential for looking at using observational data even to understand mechanisms and to identify the contribution of different mechanisms to observational estimates and to get at what are the most important. And that's kind of where some of my work fits in. A lot of us work with observational data, and very commonly we wish to know about causal inference. So if we treat or prevent hearing loss, would dementia burden also decrease? But without a trial, we can only observe statistical associations such that people with impaired hearing also have higher rates of dementia. And as we dig deeper into kind of mechanisms, this also is still an issue of, we have statistical associations, but how do we know and how do we kind of branch into causal inference from there? And there's been sort of an evolution in thinking about causal inference in epidemiology. Kind of in 1965, and Bradford Hill proposed 9 viewpoints to help determine about causal inference. And a lot of us probably have seen these, where it's kind of the more you have, you think there's more evidence for causation, such as a strong association, temporality, where the exposure becomes before the outcome, consistency or reproducibility, obviously experimental evidence. But really, the only one that's actually truly necessary for causation is temporality. All others can help make informed judgment, but they're not necessary. And kind of from this, there's been kind of a gap in, well, how do we think then about causal inference? And a shift towards kind of these more causal models. This is a Neyman-Rubin causal model, with this idea of counterfactuals or potential outcomes, which is kind of, let's imagine if everyone has a set of potential outcomes for each possible value of an exposure. We only really get to observe one of the potential outcomes for each individual, but there's an unobserved potential outcome, which is the counterfactual. So we can think about this with hearing loss. Say somebody has hearing loss, we only observe what their outcome is due to hearing loss. We don't observe what their outcome would have been if they had not had hearing loss. And this is kind of moved on to interpreting causal effects, as we really would like to be able to compare the potential outcomes for the same people that are exposed compared to them being unexposed. You know, that's kind of the ideal scenario, is that we have this kind of counterfactual comparison. But in reality, we know we can't do that. We only observe one potential outcome. So in this sense, causal inference is a missing data problem. And we take observed values and substitute them for counterfactual values. For instance, we compare outcomes for people that are exposed versus unexposed, and we assume that each group of the exposed versus unexposed are exchangeable. And if they are exchangeable or kind of the same potential outcomes, then we can get to this kind of average causal effect estimate. And this is, we use different techniques such as randomization, adjustment, or matching to do this. And obviously we have faith, particularly in randomization, and not as much faith in adjustment or matching. So confounding is kind of this idea that it's something that's present if our substitute for the counterfactual imperfectly represents what our target would have been like under the counterfactual condition. This is that meaning that the groups are not exchangeable or the same. And we can kind of ask these questions in our analyses. Which groups of people am I using to represent another's counterfactual outcome? Are they the same? Are people exchangeable? Do I have to do any sort of adjustments to make them more exchangeable? And then I think another thing which I've kind of been very interested in is thinking about what sort of causal structures could have generated the statistical associations we observe. And can we do anything to rule out these potential structures? So just gonna go through an example. This is kind of taken from some work I've done on multiple sensory impairment. In the Health ABC study, which is a cohort study of Black and white older adults, about 3,000 of them. And we just did use Cox proportional hazard models, compare risk of dementia, very kind of traditional epi study. We find kind of echoing stuff that Frank and Jennifer have done, that hearing is associated with increased risk of dementia. And then also that we find this graded association with increasing number of sensory impairments, which was kind of what we were interested in and kind of excited about. So if we look at this data kind of from the Hill criteria, we find consistent and strong associations. I've taken 2 plots from a couple papers. So one is looking at impaired senses and just the number. So increasing number of impaired senses, which was looking at hearing, vision, smell, as well as touch. So increasing number was associated with increased risk of dementia. And then kind of following up on that, I looked and created a kind of a more continuous score for multisensory impairment. And tertiles of that score also find this graded association where worst function is associated with worse cognition or increased risk of dementia. So these are consistent and strong associations. There's a plausible mechanism through which sensory impairments could affect dementia. But I think one of the main issues is temporality. We exclude prevalent dementia up to the study year entry, but I think there's a big question of whether this is long enough for a disease process like Alzheimer's disease, which takes decades to accumulate. And also we only have sensory information assessed once, and there's just kind of these limitations that we have. We can also look at this in terms of counterfactuals. So are those without sensory impairments exchangeable for those with sensory impairments? And there are a number of different characteristics that those with a higher number of sensory impairments were different from those with no impairments, such as older age, less likely to be female, and tended to have more comorbidities. There are kind of potential things we could do, which is adjusting for these, but it's very different. It's very different to adjust for them and then really to have faith in this. So we can adjust for, I adjusted for a binary variable for cardiovascular disease. It's questionable whether that really captures all the differences and potential underlying differences. And I think also it's challenging to know if we've adjusted for, sorry, I think I got this. I'm just gonna do a chat. Okay. Where it's hard to know what else we're not capturing. Basically, there's potential for unmeasured confounding. So let's think a little bit more about kind of the potential causal structures that can induce a statistical association between 2 variables. So X and Y, X is our exposure and Y is our outcome. If we find a statistical association, this could be due to one random fluctuation in our data, just chance. It could be that X caused Y. It could be that Y caused X, which is kind of reverse causation. Could also be that X and Y share a common cause, which is confounding. And another is that the statistical association was induced by conditioning on a common effect of X and Y, as in selection bias. And kind of taking this to the hearing and dementia link, I think kind of the plausible scenarios are one, there's a causal pathway where impaired hearing affects dementia. This could be due to increased isolation, social isolation, effects on neurodegeneration, or atrophy due to impaired hearing. It could also be due to increased cognitive demand or potentially a lowered resilience to underlying pathology that all lead to dementia. It could also be that there's reverse causation, and I think in this case we can think of this as people don't yet have a dementia diagnosis, but they're experiencing kind of the early stages of dementia, and that leads to impaired hearing. And then I think one that we kind of all worry about potentially the most compared to a true cause is that there's a common cause or confounding. And there's a number of different potentials such as physiologic aging, neurodegeneration, or cardiovascular metabolic disease that all can impact hearing as well as dementia risk. And so it looks like there's an association, but really it's due to these kind of shared causes. And then finally, there's also potential for measurement error, where impaired hearing can affect cognitive test scores. And we use cognitive test scores to have diagnose dementia. And so there's a potential scenario where impaired hearing is not associated with dementia, but it looks like it because of this measurement error. So our goal is to eliminate all but one of these explanations, and hopefully to eliminate the non-causal pathways. You know, we all want to have find modifiable risk factors for dementia. And so the question is how to do this and how can we infer causation from these associations. And I think this is really tricky in reality because causality is often complex and there are probably multiple valid causal mechanisms. And, you know, it's plausible that all the ones I just showed are in play. And even if that's true, we want to be able to rule out some of the explanations. We want to be able to rule out some of the mechanisms as being kind of the primary mechanism, you know, even if there's some potential for measurement error. We want to be able to still have faith in that we're at least finding the right direction of associations. And it's kind of challenging to do this. So in reality, even if we can rule out a few explanations, that would be useful. And one way to do this is use different analytic approaches and study designs to kind of target different remaining explanations. And one of the problems, I think, is if we keep using the same study design, we have the same set of underlying assumptions and susceptible biases. So for kind of our traditional observational study designs, they all have the same assumptions of no unmeasured confounding, no reverse causation, and we're not necessarily, if we keep repeating that, we're not necessarily going to be able to improve on it that much. We might have better measures for kind of physiologic aging or confounders, but we still have to justify that we've been able to account for that. And so kind of been thinking about this and how to target the different alternative pathways. And this has led to, I mean, it's hard to have one study, like I said, that can rule them all out. I think the clinical trial is one way to really, you know, that will get you causation. But I think there's a lot of potential of focusing on the individual pathways. And so kind of one that I've been thinking about is focusing on reverse causation, which is just this issue of temporality. Dementia is the end result of a decades-long disease process. And we are basically finding earlier and earlier findings that indicate people that lead to a dementia diagnosis have symptoms even potentially decades prior. And it's not just that they're accumulating pathology, but they're also experiencing subtle declines much prior to than we even really thought about. And I think potential issues with our clinical trials kind of highlight this, and we keep going earlier and earlier. So early stage disease plausibly affects auditory processing ability, and kind of hearing difficulties, really focusing more on kind of that central hearing, but kind of hearing, especially noise problem, might be a symptom of underlying disease or early Alzheimer's disease symptoms. And I kind of talk about this as reverse causation, but before I also mentioned it on the confounding. So we can kind of think about this as reverse causation or confounding. And essentially that neurodegeneration or subtle cognitive impairments lead to hearing loss and dementia. And that's why we see an association. And so thinking about this is in terms of the two plausible explanations for association between hearing loss and dementia is one, this first confounding association or reverse causation, where it's really due to underlying dementia disease that started, or it could be that hearing loss affects neurodegeneration or subtle cognitive decline, and that leads to dementia diagnosis. And kind of one way to think about, well, how do we tackle this? Well, genetic risk has really emerged as an analytic tool in terms of Mendelian randomization. And this is a very kind of different study design, and it basically uses genetic risk as a tool to establish timing and test for shared etiology. The nice thing about this is we know genes are determined at conception, prior to birth, prior to dementia diagnosis. So this really sets up a pathway that we know about. Those with higher genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease are more likely to experience neurodegeneration and cognitive impairment that leads to dementia. So we can use this and test whether genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease is associated with hearing loss. And that might indicate this kind of alternative pathway through which there might be effects of reverse causation. So we looked at this association, and kind of the basis for this is one, if we find an association between genetic risk for hearing loss, it indicates this kind of top pathway where genetic risk is kind of leading to hearing loss, either through neurodegeneration or kind of alternatively. And, you know, the ideal would be that we could actually rule out this pathway, in which case genetic risk for AD would not be associated with hearing loss. And that would help rule out this, this pathway and kind of support a little bit more that hearing loss is the cause, and that's the primary association. So we looked at UK Biobank data, which is a sample of about 500,000 adults aged 40 to 69. Most of the analyses focused on the older adults. And unfortunately, we use mostly those with Caucasian genetic ancestry because a lot of the genetic studies have been done in those samples. We used genetic risk score for Alzheimer's disease, which is a weighted sum of 23 genetic variants that are all previously shown to be associated with Alzheimer's disease. And we also looked at dementia diagnosis during follow-up, which was up to 11 years of follow-up and based on ICD-9 or 10 codes. For hearing, we had several different measures. Unfortunately, kind of one of the limitations of this is no measure of peripheral hearing alone, but there is self-rated. Do you have difficulty with your hearing? Do you have difficulty with your hearing with background noise? And then also a digit triplet test, which is a speech and noise test that was specifically developed for UK Biobank and assessed via touchscreen. And we calculated a speech reception threshold from that, following the approach of prior studies. So just to give a little bit more info on that test, it was given to a subset of participants, so not everybody, and they're asked to remove hearing aids, kind of guided by video demonstration, and had 15 sets of digit triplets plus noise. And we use the speech reception threshold, which is the mean signal to noise ratio for the triplets 8 through 15, based on the better hearing ear. We used a continuous measure and then also a binary measure, which was kind of based on a prior established cut point. So some of the participant characteristics for the study: the mean age is about 56. The dementia prevalence during follow-up is very low. It's about 0.5%. And you can see, though, that that problem hearing was much more common, and particularly problem hearing with noise. And hearing aid use was about 5%. All of these measures increase with age at baseline. And we can see the problem hearing with noise is kind of the most common one. So first we confirmed prior established relationships between hearing and dementia, just to kind of make sure we were at least in the right area, that these measures are associated with dementia. So they're all kind of go from odds ratio about 1.06 to almost 2 for the poor speech and noise hearing test. So that's pretty strong. And next, this is looking at the Alzheimer's genetic risk score, which we find was associated with poor hearing in the older but not younger ages. So you can see in the younger ages, it's all pretty close to 1. The effect sizes obviously are not very large here, but especially the problem hearing and noise and speech and noise tests are popping out as associated with the genetic risk score for Alzheimer's disease. Increasing quartile of the ADGRS was associated with speech and noise hearing as well. Kind of, once again, small effects, but we do find kind of the highest quartile in particular, and a slight indication of a trend there. So I think one of the challenges is, how do we interpret these effect sizes? So we also use kind of a more traditional instrumental variable analysis, which is basically taking the genetic risk score as a proxy for dementia during follow-up and saying, well, based on that association, what would we estimate the effect of dementia during follow-up as impacting problem hearing or problem hearing and noise? So this is kind of a weird analysis, but the idea was to get at what is the effect of incipient dementia, kind of focusing on those that developed dementia a few years later. What is that effect on probability of poor hearing? And it was about a 25 to 39% risk difference based on kind of a dementia diagnosis. So those that are predicted to have dementia are more likely to have problem hearing and noise. And these are a little bit larger effects than kind of we would just assume with the genetic variants. So kind of what are the summary and interpretations we can take from this? We find support for reverse causation or shared genetics in this analysis. Obviously, we're focusing on hearing with background noise, which would be potentially more susceptible to this. But part of it was just kind of, would we find even anything? Is interesting. These are people that basically don't have dementia for the most part. If they do have dementia, it's a very small subgroup. So most of these people are much earlier in their process. They might eventually get Alzheimer's disease, but I think it's kind of an interesting sample to find effects in. And I think one of the questions, though, is really, is this finding due to AD genes effects on subtle cognitive impairment and neurodegeneration, or is this more related due to alternative pathways such as other common age-related risk factors? I think one of the things that looking at the younger ages we find is there's not just a kind of wide age spread of these effects. It's really targeted at the ages we would expect to see people to start to have impairments due to AD potentially. So like all studies, there's some caveats and limitations kind of beyond just the measurement issue that I talked about. There's plenty of other mechanisms and sources of biases that could explain the relationship between hearing loss and dementia that we can't target with this study. This approach does not test or exclude the possibility that hearing loss causes cognitive decline. It kind of merely gives a little bit of a picture into that there might be this reverse causation or shared confounding pathway. And I think it really kind of sets up more for a need for more work rather than something we can really rely on necessarily. So what are the next steps with this? One is to replicate and extend these findings. I think it would be interesting to kind of look at peripheral hearing loss in particular. Sadly, a lot of this Mendelian randomization relies on very large sample sizes, so that's kind of a limiting factor. And then I think also looking at the opposite direction, so looking at genetic risk for hearing and whether that's associated with cognition can also help add to a causal estimate as well. And I did this a little bit, but the genetic risk for hearing is much less defined compared to genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease. And then I think also there's a lot of potential for using this to test other pathways, such as kind of our causal pathway, but also different common causes of the sensory impairment and dementia, and then cognitive tests. This is just kind of from my K, which part of my interest is kind of how do we tackle these different ways. So that's kind of where my next steps are, is I'm still going with looking at the Mendelian randomization, but also how do we look at other pathways? What else can we do? So especially the prior results kind of led me to think about, well, is impaired hearing associated with biologic markers of AD or other dementias? Could we look at a neuropathology sample, for instance, which is kind of where I did my work in grad school. So we looked at that in the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center autopsy sample. And this has its own set of biases and issues, but even finding an association could help establish a biologic mechanism, whether it's causal or common cause, it's unclear. But evidence of associations can also help rule out measurement error pathways. And we really weren't sure if we'd actually find anything. So we looked at a variety of different neuropathology measures and did find that in those with normal cognition at baseline, they tended to have higher Brock stage, which is a measure of neurofibrillary degeneration, which is tau, kind of one of the main indicators of Alzheimer's disease, which is amyloid plaques and tau tangles. And interestingly, we didn't really find a link with amyloid plaques. So that's kind of like a first step into testing some of this other pathway there. A lot of this stuff just raises more questions. And then kind of another way to get at this as well is looking at mediation analyses. So does social isolation or mobility mediate the relationship between sensory impairments and dementia? If we find that there's mediation, this also supports a causal association. And then also is just important for us to know kind of what is mediating these associations. It'd be kind of difficult if we don't have our timing well established, but even kind of a little hint of mediation, can lead us to different steps. So I looked at this a little bit with the multisensory score and kind of adjusting for social isolation, mobility, various kind of potential mediators, and seeing whether that would kind of attenuate our effect estimates. There's other fancier methods for looking at mediation, but this is kind of just, well, is there any signal here? And we did find that there's a slight attenuation of effects. And this was, interestingly, it was mainly due to mobility rather than social isolation. And that could be because we're kind of looking at this multisensory score, which really encapsulates more than just hearing loss. And so kind of just some final thoughts. I think the relationships between hearing loss and dementia are likely complex. And it's important to understand the possible causal structures that we are testing in our analyses. And I think that's something that we all have to work with limitations often in our data, but really kind of thinking through and understanding what these different causal structures are can really help kind of empower us to know and trust in our findings, to identify new ways to address these issues. And I think there's been a move towards triangulating evidence in epidemiology, which is this idea that we can use multiple approaches and really kind of take information from a variety of different methods, different samples, different hearing measures, outcomes, and together kind of incorporate this information. And that will lend strength more towards understanding causal inference, but also kind of identifying these kind of key questions that we have like in the field and what is explaining the relationship between hearing loss and dementia. And that's all I have. I'd like to thank my mentors and collaborators and data and funding from NIA and Alzheimer's Association. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Brenowitz, thank you so much. That was a lovely presentation. Thank you also for the rigor with which you are thinking about these questions and what you're bringing to the field. I think it's so important. Right now, we want to go ahead and open up for questions. I had a couple come through on the chat, so I'm happy to read those. If you have a question, please feel free to post to the chat, or if you prefer to speak, please let us know, just raising your hand, and we'll be able to let you ask your question yourself. So your first question, I think it's going back all the way, thinking back to the Health ABC study that you presented towards the beginning of your talk when you were talking about the multiple sensory deficits. And the question is, should olfactory loss be considered as risk factor for dementia? Is it not rather a marker of brain loss?
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree. And that's actually one of the things, I didn't go into that in too much detail, but those studies are really focused on just identifying associations, because I think one question was, if we add these different sensory impairments, are we going to kind of identify those that are even higher risk of dementia, and whether that's because they are just markers for dementia, is having multiple senses impaired, maybe that's just a marker for underlying dementia disease. So I think the question is broader than just olfaction, with the caveat that we think there are different mechanisms with those. And I think olfaction is really more strongly linked with preclinical Alzheimer's disease than, say, hearing loss. So I think that I wouldn't necessarily use that as like, that was mostly just an example of kind of what studies I have that we can kind of tease apart these questions. But I think that's an important question, and kind of gets back to understanding the different potential mechanisms when we're designing analyses as well, and when we're trying to really hone in on potential risk factors.
Thank you. The next question is going back to your study, so this must be with the instrumental variables. So the comment is very nice study design. The question is, could you please explain whether the assumptions of using the instrument are satisfied and maybe potentially violated in that case, in that study?
Yeah, so let's see if I can go back to some of that. I didn't put up too much about the Mendelian randomization studies because there are a set of kind of criteria that are used to determine whether that's a valid analysis or not. We know, so one of the main things is if we're using an instrument, so this is genetic risk is kind of, we can think of as an instrument for this kind of pathway or proxy. And so we know that those with genetic risk are much more likely to develop dementia. So that satisfies kind of the most important criteria. And one of the things is there are different methods that you can use to see, well, genes have many effects. There's potential for pleiotropy. And we use different techniques to look at that and didn't find evidence. But I kind of caution with actually saying we can really pin down this pathway because I think there's more work that needs to be done there. But mostly we just find that genetic risk for AD is associated with hearing loss. And that could be due to a couple of different mechanisms that I think we need further work to really understand.
Thank you. Okay, so I have another series of questions and comments, starting out with outstanding presentation, very clear and interesting. From the same participant, one of the problems of observational epi studies is left truncation. Ideal life course study should also be done. So that's one comment. And then from the same participant, so another issue is, another issue is effect modification. And so I throw this out there, especially for many of our trainees who are thinking about effect modification questions related to hearing. And so perhaps only a subgroup of those with hearing loss are more likely to develop dementia.
Yeah, I think, as you go in more, it just gets more and more complicated. And I think one of the challenges is how do we kind of embrace and tease apart this complexity? And I think effect modification is one of those. The other thing that I'm usually thinking about effect modification is hearing loss. Here, I don't necessarily show it, but it could be, there's another kind of pathway in this set of hearing loss modifies the effect of, say, genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease on dementia. And I think that maybe doesn't look any different than a causal association. And it's probably something we care more about in the long run because even delaying dementia onset by a year or two has enormous benefits. And helping people preserve their mentality and kind of preserve their activities of daily living can really help them. Whereas we don't necessarily care if they have, do their brains have amyloid in them? Maybe isn't the most important question.
Thank you. And hopefully we have time for at least one more question. So it's, do you have any speculations about a potential underlying mechanism linking social isolation and dementia onset?
For the social isolation in particular, I think it kind of goes along with social engagement as well. And I think that was actually also identified in the Lancet Commission in 2020 as something that's, there's a fair amount of observational data on this and a bunch of trials and kind of interventions trying to get older adults to keep being engaged. I think that one could be more due to effects on resilience or cognitive reserve. And so kind of helping people preserve their brains in the face of underlying dementia rather than necessarily something that's impacting their underlying neurodegeneration. But I think one question is, what about over the life course as having kind of social engagement over the life course as potential more effect on something, we just don't really know. Yeah.
There's also, I think it was a follow-up question to that question as well. So, and the comment is particular in reference to your K with psychosocial well-being and the mediation model. So I think that question was also specifically targeted at that last study.
Yeah, and that's kind of getting at one of my interest areas of, is hearing loss potentially connected through just increasing psychosocial well-being. That I think would be, I feel like there's a lot of plausibility for that, and that would be very kind of exciting to see. But my issues with that is that it's very challenging to actually do mediation, like when we already have a group of older adults, because of that issue of reverse causation.
Okay. Any other questions from our audience? Okay. Dr. Brenowitz, thank you so much for being here. I think this was an outstanding first seminar. Really delighted that you can join us. And for everyone else, we hope to see you in about a month. It would be, I believe, Dr. Larry Humes from Indiana University talking to us then. So thank you very much. Take care, and we wish you all a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.